June 1996, a 20-year-old law student finishes her exams and heads out to celebrate with friends on one of the warmest nights of the year. Hours later, she vanishes on her walk home. CCTV captures her weaving through Preston's streets. Witnesses see her trying to hitchhike. Then, a man in a white shirt is seen arguing with a woman near a bridge. By morning, Janet Murgatroyd is found beaten and floating in the River Ribble. Nearly 30 years later, despite confessions, arrests, and court trials, her killer may still be walking free. This is the haunting, unsolved murder of Janet Murgatroyd. Welcome to Crimes That Haunt Us. We release a new case every Sunday, so hit subscribe and don't miss the next one. And let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Janet Mary Murgatroyd came into this world on the 8th of September 1975. She was raised in Penwortham, a suburb of Preston where the family lived. She attended St Wilfrid's RC Primary School in Preston and later went on to the All Hallows School, a Roman Catholic secondary school in Penwortham. Contemporaries and teachers remembered Janet as radiant, bright, caring, independent, confident, and energetic. She was described as someone full of life with a clear sense of purpose and ambition. Janet lived with her mother Mary in a quiet cul-de-sac called Broad Oak Green in Penwortham. Mary had divorced Janet's father David in the years prior, though despite this they had maintained a close relationship. Janet had worked part-time as a clerk for the Crime Input Bureau at Lancashire Police Headquarters, while studying law at the University of Central Lancashire. Saturday, the 15th of June 1996. Across England, the day would become remembered for very different reasons. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, the IRA, detonated a £3,300 lorry bomb on Corporation Street at the Arndale shopping centre in central Manchester. It was the largest explosive device detonated in Great Britain since World War II. For Janet, however, it was supposed to be a day of celebration. She had just completed her first year studying law and had finished her exams. She had planned on travelling into Manchester to buy some clothes, but after hearing the news of the bombing, she cancelled. Instead, she went to St Winfrid's Church, where she lit a candle and said a quiet prayer for the victims of the bombing. Just before 1 p.m. that Saturday, Janet was captured on CCTV at Preston's NatWest branch, withdrawing cash for what she had been looking forward to, an evening out with her friend Fiona. At the time, it was an ordinary moment, one that wouldn't have caught a second glance from anyone passing by. Little could Janet know that within 12 hours, she would be dead. She then went and met her university friend Fiona Watson in Preston town. The pair had planned to backpack around Europe during the holidays, Italy first, then on to Greece. Excited for the summer ahead, they spent the afternoon browsing for clothes for the trip before later spending the evening drinking and socializing in mainly two local pubs, the Adelphi pub and the Wall Street, both popular student bars in Preston. It would be the last night out they would spend together before setting off on their planned adventure. That evening, Preston was in full Euro 96 fever. England were playing Scotland and would go on to win 2-0, sending the town into celebration. The pubs were packed, voices spilled into the street, and the atmosphere was loud and full of energy. Over the course of the day, both Fiona and Janet had met up with several friends and had consumed a lot of alcohol. By their own admission, both were very drunk. The pair stayed on at the Adelphi for last orders at the bar. Then, at some stage that evening, they separated and made their own ways home without properly saying goodbye. Each had assumed the other had already left in a taxi. At the time, there appeared to be nothing unusual about it. There were no reported disturbances that evening, and nothing untoward. But somewhere ahead, Janet's journey home was about to take a dark turn. Janet would later be observed by witnesses appearing visibly drunk as she wandered along the streets on her journey home. It is possible she had been refused a taxi due to her level of intoxication. She was described as wearing a white-ribbed short-sleeved top, mid-blue denim jeans, and kicker-type boots. Shortly after midnight, Janet's final known movements would be pieced together through CCTV footage and witness accounts. At 12:30 a.m., Janet was seen outside Tokyo Joe's nightclub on Church Street. At 12:49 a.m., she is then seen outside the Kentucky Fried Chicken near the Fishergate Center as she continued making her way towards home. At 12:53 a.m., she was seen again passing the old entrance to the railway station. She was then spotted on CCTV as she weaved her way down Fishergate towards the bridge. At the time, she was simply another face in a busy town on a Saturday night, another person making their way home after an evening out. A man named John Livesey, who had just collected his mother, later recalled seeing Janet looking drunk near the bridge. His mother suggested they should offer her a lift. Janet attempted to thumb a lift from them, but John decided against it, worrying she might become sick in the car. This brief encounter lasting only moments. Further witnesses also reported seeing a woman matching Janet's description standing at the beginning of Penwortham Bridge, appearing intoxicated and attempting to hitchhike a lift. By now, the noise and celebration of the town centre were beginning to fade behind her. Around 1 a.m., a man living beside the beginning of the bridge heard shouting and arguing outside in a nearby park. Looking out his window, he saw a man wearing a white long-sleeved shirt and black trousers shouting at a woman matching Janet's description. But the witness thought little of it. Arguments and disturbances were common due to the nearby pubs, and seeing nothing unusual, he returned to bed. At 1:10 a.m., Janet is seen at the corner of Broadgate for the last official time. Then at around 1:15 a.m., taxi driver Ashlyn Sperrin was crossing over the bridge when she noticed a man and a woman arguing outside the Volvo garage. She later remembered the woman appearing much taller than the man. Moments later, as she drove further onto the bridge, she saw a man wearing a white long-sleeved shirt and black trousers run directly across the road in front of her taxi, chasing a woman matching Janet's description. The pair crossed the road and disappeared from sight. The taxi driver continued over the bridge. Then, at approximately 1:30 a.m., two brothers, Jonathan and Paul Richardson, were walking over Penwortham Bridge after spending the evening at a nightclub in Preston. Given how mild the night had been, they had decided to walk home. But as they reached the far side of the bridge near Penwortham Holmes allotments, they heard something coming from the darkness. The sound of a woman groaning, high-pitched, almost like a muffled wail. Then the sound of snapping twigs. One of the brothers, who worked at a dentist's surgery, later described the sounds as similar to patients coming around from an anesthetic. Looking into the undergrowth, they saw a man wearing a white shirt crouched down. The man turned and looked directly back at them. Given the area's murky reputation, the brothers decided against investigating further and continued home. But later, one detail would become chilling. The exact area they had looked towards that night would later be identified as the place where police discovered Janet's bloodied clothing. This was the spot where Janet Murgatroyd was murdered. The 20-year-old law student never did make it home. At 12 p.m. on the 16th of June, a man out walking his dog along the River Ribble near Margaret Road noticed something in the water. At first, it was simply an object drifting in the river. Then the awful reality began to emerge. He shouted over to a man on a boat pulling a jet ski and asked him to help confirm what he was seeing. Indeed, it was a body. Police were contacted immediately. Officers quickly descended on the scene and cordoned off the area. The woman found in the water was Janet Murgatroyd. She was naked and had obvious head wounds from a severe beating, along with a broken jaw and broken nose. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had been celebrating the end of her university exams with friends. A major murder inquiry was immediately launched, with 50 detectives assigned to the case. Detectives fanned out and began searching the riverbanks, tracing the route back towards Penwortham Bridge. As officers searched through the undergrowth for answers, an unexpected discovery was made. An Evening Post photographer taking pictures of the crime scene had come across a blood-stained shirt and immediately handed it to officers. Nearby, investigators recovered hiking boots and a white overcoat, all belonging to Janet, but some important items were missing. There was no sign of Janet's stonewashed Wrangler jeans. There was also no sign of her purse. Then came another strange development. Some children had reportedly contacted police claiming they had found Janet's missing jeans, but when officers raced over to them, the children had disappeared. The jeans were gone. To this day, those jeans have never been recovered. Further searches uncovered some of Janet's other jewellery hidden beneath a bush. Police frogmen later entered the murky waters of the River Ribble, searching for any further clues connected to the brutal killing. As the post-mortem examination continued, the full extent of Janet's injuries began to emerge. Initially, it was concluded that Janet had been in the water for up to 12 hours and had died from drowning. However, over the following weeks, that estimate changed dramatically. Investigators later believed she may have been only in the water for as little as up to 30 minutes. Janet had finger-shaped bruising around her mouth, suggesting someone may have held her mouth shut to stop her screaming. She had extensive bruising to her head, neck and face, along with a broken nose and broken jaw. The pathologist did not believe a weapon had been used. Instead, Janet had been repeatedly punched and kicked. In total, there were 59 separate injuries. The coroner believed the injuries themselves would ultimately have caused death even if she had not entered the water. Her body was also covered in scratches and abrasions, indicating she had been dragged through briars and undergrowth. If that was the case, detectives believed her killer likely would have carried scratches from that night too. There were no signs of sexual assault, although investigators believe there had been some sexual activity of some description before the attack. She also showed signs of hydrostatic pneumonia. Detectives began forming a theory. They believed Janet had been viciously attacked around the head and left unconscious beside the riverbank. Then, as the tide slowly rose during the early hours, the water carried her body downstream until it was eventually discovered by the dog walker. As detectives worked to reconstruct Janet's final movements, time had become critical. Somewhere within witness statements, CCTV footage, and fleeting encounters from that summer night, investigators believed the answers already existed. On the 18th of June, detectives appealed for help tracing the couple seen arguing violently in the small park off Broadgate at around 1 a.m. near Penwortham Bridge. Police believed the pair could hold vital information for the investigation. Police also gathered dozens of videotapes from businesses along Janet's final route home. Hour after hour of footage was collected and carefully reviewed in an effort to retrace Janet's exact journey and identify anyone who may have crossed her path. On the 26th of June, police issued another appeal. This time they were attempting to identify a woman who had unknowingly walked just yards past where Janet had been attacked only minutes later. Investigators released a still image of the woman taken from nearby CCTV, timestamped at 1:36 a.m. They believed there was a possibility that she may have even seen something important. 2 days later, on the 28th of June, a packed crowd gathered to say goodbye to Janet. Family, friends, colleagues, and former classmates attended a memorial service for Janet at St. Teresa's Church. But even as they mourned, the investigation continued relentlessly. Because the coroner would not authorize the release of Janet's body for burial while inquiries remained ongoing and further examinations might still be required. For Janet's loved ones, there were still no answers. On the 3rd of July, Home Office pathologist Dr. Edmund Tapp told the opened coroner's inquest that Janet had likely lain unconscious beside the riverbank for around 6 hours before the rising tide engulfed her and carried her body into the River Ribble, where she later drowned. He also stated that her injuries alone were severe enough to cause death and likely would have done so had she been left elsewhere away from the water. It was a deeply disturbing possibility. By mid-July, detectives had interviewed over 1,000 people, yet despite the scale of the investigation, definitive answers remained elusive. Robbery had been ruled out as a motive, and investigators instead began considering a sexually motivated attack. Detectives questioned whether signs of sexual activity suggested Janet may have been attempting to placate her attacker. Police also continued appealing for the man and woman seen arguing near the Volvo garage to come forward. Meanwhile, outside the investigation itself, fear had begun spreading across Preston. Taxi firms saw a sharp rise in business. Many women no longer wanted to walk alone at night. Students in particular felt vulnerable because somewhere in Preston, the person responsible had still not been caught. On the 9th of July, Crime Stoppers offered a reward of £5,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Janet's killer. The investigation was growing rapidly in scale. Detectives were following hundreds of leads, reviewing witness statements and examining relentless amounts of CCTV footage in the hope that somewhere, buried within the details, was the person responsible. Then on the 9th of August, police made another public appeal, asking for 12 people they wished to speak to who had been in the area at the crucial time of Janet's murder to come forward. Investigators believed these individuals may have unknowingly crossed paths with the killer that night. Among these 12 were the couple seen arguing near the Volvo garage, a man who had got out of a taxi after paying a £2 fare with a £5 note, 2 males and a female seen running towards and away from the murder site, a man observed briskly walking over the Penwortham flyover, a man in a white short-sleeved shirt seen at around 1:15 a.m, and a group of Asian males seen standing near the chemist at Fishergate. Then on the 27th of August, another development emerged. Police released an identikit image of a sex attacker linked to 7 offences in the Preston area. The man had indecently assaulted and exposed himself to several women along cycle routes near the River Ribble, the same general area where Janet had been murdered. Although detectives did not directly connect him to Janet's killing, they were actively exploring whether the two investigations shared any links. Then on September 3rd, Janet Murgatroyd's case was featured on BBC's Crimewatch. For millions watching at home, Janet's final known movements were reconstructed in vivid detail. The program showed CCTV footage of Janet visibly intoxicated as she made her way through Preston during the early hours. It also reconstructed the man and woman seen arguing near the Volvo garage who still had not come forward. Detectives gave a description of another man they urgently wanted to identify. He was described as between 5'10" and 6 foot tall, a white or pale-skinned Asian male with black hair wearing a long-sleeved white shirt and black trousers. The program then showed CCTV footage from approximately 1 a.m. on the 16th of June, capturing 2 men walking down Fishergate Hill shortly before Janet appeared on the same camera. One of these men closely matched the earlier detective's description. Another separate CCTV image showed a man wearing a long-sleeved white shirt walking along Strand Road near the bridge around the same time Janet would have been approaching. Later footage appeared to show the same man walking back away from the bridge. Police hoped someone watching would recognize a face, a walk, or even the smallest detail. The program generated over 50 calls, giving detectives fresh lines of inquiry to follow. For the first time in months, there was renewed hope that somewhere amongst those calls, someone had finally seen the missing piece. On the 16th of September, police released a profile of the person they believed had killed Janet Murgatroyd. The profile suggested the killer had local knowledge of Preston and was likely a man in his 20s or possibly younger with a history of violence, particularly towards women. Investigators believed he had likely experienced a disturbed childhood, resulting in an inability to form normal and meaningful relationships. They also believed the killer either knew Janet or had interacted with her briefly that night before the attack. Importantly, detectives did not believe the murder had been premeditated. The picture investigators were building was unsettling. This was not an outsider passing through, but potentially someone far more local, someone familiar with the streets and surroundings. On the 19th of September, police released a still image from CCTV of another man they wished to speak to. He had been captured walking along Strand Road towards the bridge at approximately 12:50 a.m. and then later returning the same way at 2:27 a.m. Detectives described him as appearing to stagger in the footage. Extensive door-to-door inquiries followed, with officers showing his image to local residents. Then, at least 2 people identified this man. Not long afterwards, he himself contacted police and attended for an interview. It is understood that he was later treated as a potential witness rather than a suspect. But as the months passed and 1996 slowly drew to a close, the investigation was beginning to lose momentum. For Janet's mother Mary, life had become almost unrecognizable. The home she had once shared with her only child now felt painfully empty. Meanwhile, Janet's father David wrote a heartfelt letter through the Evening Post urging anyone with information to come forward. But 6 months into the investigation, detectives had reached a wall. Most of the people officers had sought as witnesses had been traced and eliminated from inquiries. The case was beginning to grow cold. Police believed somebody out there knew the truth and was protecting the killer. By this stage, detectives had taken approximately 1,400 statements and entered around 2,500 names into the investigation database, and of those names, 213 individuals remained unidentified, with 160 of those male. Then, in May 1999, Janet's name suddenly returned to the media once again. Police released a sketch of a man they were searching for in connection with several incidents involving young women along the same route Janet had taken on the night she was murdered. 3 years had passed, yet attention was once again turning back towards the same streets. Although police stressed they were not officially linking the incidents to Janet's murder, investigators were examining any possible connection. In one particularly unsettling incident, the man had approached a woman in the early hours and began talking about the murder of Janet Murgatroyd. This suspect is described as in his mid-30s, around 6 feet tall, of stocky build, with a possible bodybuilding background. No direct connection was ever established. Then, on the 3rd of August, the investigation took a dramatic turn. News broke that a 25-year-old man from Penwortham had been charged with Janet's murder. For the first time in years, there appeared to be movement in the case. The previous day, Andrew Philip Greenwood had reportedly been found in a suicidal state in the back of a taxi where he began making disturbing admissions. He allegedly told the driver, "I've done something bad. I'm going in for a long time." The taxi driver pulled over when he noticed 2 officers getting out of a van. Andrew Greenwood repeated those assertions. Once arrested and questioned, Greenwood made further admissions about the killing. He confessed to murdering her 3 years earlier following what he described as a chance encounter. According to Greenwood, he had spoken to Janet, and after she laughed at him, he punched and kicked her on the riverbank. He also mentioned details that immediately caught investigators' attention. He correctly identified the date as the England vs Scotland Euro '96 match. He admitted he had been drinking at the time. He was also inebriated as he made these admissions. For detectives, these did not appear to be vague or passing comments. These were detailed admissions. Suddenly, a case that had been growing cold felt alive again. Andrew Philip Greenwood was then brought before a brief 4-minute hearing at Chorley Magistrates Court and remanded into custody. Over the coming months, he would continue appearing before the courts for further hearings. After years of uncertainty, detectives believed they might finally have found the man responsible. For Janet's family, there was perhaps a feeling they had not experienced in a long time: hope. Then, in another dramatic twist, on the 2nd of November 1999, the case took another unexpected turn. The judge ordered that Andrew Greenwood be released on bail while further evidence was collated by the prosecution. For detectives who believed they had finally found the breakthrough they had been searching for, it was a significant setback. As further details emerged, the picture surrounding Greenwood began to grow more complicated. It was revealed that Andrew Greenwood had not previously been on police's radar as a suspect in Janet's murder. He had not emerged through forensic evidence, he had not been identified through witness accounts. Instead, he had effectively brought himself into the investigation. And following his arrest and remand, Greenwood then retracted his earlier admissions. He now claimed the confession was false. He stated that any details he had provided about Janet's murder had come from media reports and television coverage of the case. He denied murdering Janet Murgatroyd outright. His defense then produced forensics evidence which reportedly suggested the probability that another man may have been responsible. Questions detectives had believed were finally being answered suddenly began resurfacing. As a result, Greenwood was released to a bail hostel pending the trial. But then on the 16th of December 1999, the case took another major turn. The Crown Prosecution Service dropped the charges against Greenwood entirely. Although prosecutors accepted there was a prima facie case against him, they concluded the evidence did not meet the threshold required for prosecution. The man who only months earlier had been charged with Janet's murder was now walking free. For Janet's family, the emotional impact was devastating. After years of waiting, justice had briefly seemed within reach, then it was gone again. But the long and painful journey for the Murgatroyd family was far from over. Less than a year later, the case would once again return to court, and once again, Andrew Greenwood would find himself at the center of it. On the 3rd of October 2000, Andrew Philip Greenwood was charged once more with the murder of Janet Murgatroyd at Chorley Magistrates Court. Again, he was remanded into custody awaiting trial. Then another unexpected development emerged. A man had been arrested in possession of some of Janet Murgatroyd's missing belongings, items she had been carrying on the night she was murdered. On the 15th of November 2000, Raymond Hayes appeared before Chorley Magistrates after being charged when police discovered he had been in possession of Janet's distinctive locket, chain and purse. For investigators, it raised an obvious question. How had he come into possession of items connected to Janet's final hours? On the 23rd of February 2001, Raymond Hayes, a barman from Broadgate, was convicted of theft and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. But while Hayes had now been held accountable for stealing Janet's belongings, the far more troubling question still remained unanswered. What, if any, had been his involvement in Janet's final hours? Hayes admitted taking Janet's belongings after claiming he had seen her collapsed near the Preston railway station, apparently heavily affected by alcohol. He said he rifled through her handbag, stealing her purse, money and jewellery before later leaving the area and going to a friend's house with a takeaway. According to Hayes, he only realised the significance of what had happened days later. He claimed he panicked after learning that the woman he had stolen from had become the victim of murder that same night. He stated that he threw away the items he had taken, all except one, Janet's distinctive locket. He had given it to his girlfriend's mother. For years, Hayes had remained unidentified. But 4 years after Janet's murder, police released CCTV footage from that night. Someone recognized him, his own girlfriend. She had contacted police, ultimately leading to his arrest and questioning. It is at this point detectives later recovered Janet's locket. Still, Hayes denied any involvement in the murder of Janet and maintained he had simply stolen from her and nothing more. On June 2003, attention once again turned back to Andrew Greenwood. Nearly 7 years had now passed since Janet had set out on what should have been a routine journey home. The trial of Andrew Greenwood for the murder of Janet Murgatroyd finally began. From the beginning, however, there was a significant problem. The prosecution's entire case rested almost entirely on Greenwood's confessions. There was no forensic evidence placing him at the scene, no eyewitness identifying him as Janet's attacker, no direct physical evidence linking him to Janet at all. Instead, prosecutors argued that Greenwood had repeatedly confessed in considerable detail. They told the court that Greenwood had first made admissions inside the taxi, telling the driver he had killed someone. As the taxi driver stopped beside the two officers, Greenwood then approached them, claiming he had killed Janet 3 years earlier after a chance encounter on Penwortham Bridge. According to his admissions, Greenwood said he had spoken to Janet and after she laughed at him, he punched and kicked her on the riverbank. He claimed he stripped her and threw her into the River Ribble before watching her body float away before later returning home feeling sick. Prosecutors also highlighted another detail. The prosecution reminded the jury that Greenwood had repeated similar admissions across 5 separate interviews that same day. Some statements reportedly included details investigators believed aligned with forensic findings, including Janet still being alive when placed in the water. The prosecution also claimed Greenwood confessed to family members, cellmates and a priest while in custody and had later apologized for his actions upon being charged. To the prosecution, the motive was simple. They portrayed Greenwood as a lonely and desperate man whose advances towards Janet had been rejected during a chance encounter. On paper, the confessions appeared powerful, but the defense was preparing to challenge them at every turn. They argued Andrew Greenwood's confessions were false. Greenwood had retracted his admissions and claimed that any accurate details he gave had not come from personal involvement in Janet's murder at all. Instead, he stated that information had come from media coverage surrounding the case, including newspaper reports and the Crimewatch broadcast. The defense also questioned Greenwood's state of mind at the time of his confessions. He had been drinking heavily. He had also been depressed. And they suggested he may have been seeking attention when making the statements. The question facing the jury became increasingly difficult. What if the confessions simply were not true? The defense then moved towards one of the most controversial areas of the trial. They attempted to introduce evidence relating to two other men who had been investigated during the early stages of the murder inquiry but were never charged. This material had been accepted during the preparation for the earlier trial, but during the later proceedings, much of it would be ruled inadmissible. The first individual the defense wanted to raise was Janet's former boyfriend, John Parkinson. Known by the nickname Pitbull, Parkinson had a documented history of violent and abusive behavior towards Janet, supported by accounts from Parkinson's former wife and statements attributed to Janet herself. Janet's mother had also provided a sworn statement in which she claimed Parkinson blamed the Murgatroyd family for a drink-driving case against him and had once phoned Janet saying, "You're dead," before hanging up. Mary also claimed that months earlier, Janet had told her the Pitbull had been in, meaning Parkinson had burglarized the home in which clothing had been taken, including some of her underwear from the washing line outside. The defense also pointed to another detail they believed was significant. Janet's blood had reportedly been found on a pair of Parkinson's boxer shorts recovered from his home. They wanted to use this material, along with other evidence and statements, to argue that alternative suspects existed and to challenge the reliability of Greenwood's confessions. The second individual raised by the defense was Raymond Hayes. By this point, Hayes had already been convicted of theft and being found in possession of Janet's belongings from the night she died. Hayes had admitted taking the items after claiming he had found Janet collapsed near Preston railway station but denied any involvement in her murder. He provided an account for his movements afterwards and maintained his innocence regarding the killing itself. However, the trial judge ruled that much of the defense evidence relating to both Parkinson and Hayes would not be admissible regarding the issue of whether Greenwood's confessions were truthful or not. The Crown had initially been willing to allow some of it, but the judge excluded it all. At the time, it was a legal decision made during the course of the trial. Later, it would become something much bigger than that. On the 30th of June 2003, the jury reached its verdict. Andrew Greenwood was acquitted of murder by majority verdict, but they convicted him of manslaughter by a vote of 10-1. For Janet's family, the decision brought a mixture of emotions. After years of unanswered questions and uncertainty, there had finally been a conviction, yet the outcome itself remained complicated. The prosecution had failed to prove murder, but Greenwood was now being held responsible for Janet's death. On the 21st of July 2003, Greenwood is then sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. However, almost immediately, the defense began preparing an appeal. They argued that Greenwood had not received a fair trial. Central to that argument was the exclusion of evidence concerning other potential suspects. The defense maintained that preventing the jury from hearing material relating to John Parkinson and Raymond Hayes had stopped them from fully challenging the reliability of Greenwood's confessions and from exploring whether stronger lines of inquiry may have existed elsewhere. The prosecution maintained that alternative suspects had been thoroughly investigated and their involvement ruled out. But the issue would not disappear. Instead, it became the central focus of the appeal itself. Then, in May 2004, the case took another dramatic turn. The Court of Appeal, led by Lord Justice Waller, quashed Greenwood's manslaughter conviction, ruling it unsafe. The judges determined that evidence concerning John Parkinson should have been admitted because it was relevant to assessing whether Greenwood's confessions were truthful. Since that material had been available during the first trial proceedings but excluded from the second, the conviction could not be considered safe. Andrew Greenwood was released after serving just part of his sentence. For Janet's family, it was another devastating blow. After years of investigations, arrests, court hearings, and apparent breakthroughs, the case had once again slipped away. Following his release on the 28th of May 2004, Andrew Philip Greenwood faced no further charges in connection with Janet Murgatroyd's death. Over the following 2 decades, the case periodically resurfaced through documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, podcasts, and anniversary appeals. Police continued highlighting missing items such as Janet's stonewashed Wrangler jeans and urging anyone with information to come forward. But despite advances in forensic science and repeated appeals for information, no further suspects have been charged and no breakthrough substantial enough to reopen proceedings has been publicly announced as of the airing of this documentary. Nearly 3 decades later, the question that haunted Preston in the summer of '96 still remain. What happened in those final moments on the River Ribble? Who attacked Janet Murgatroyd? And who, if anyone, has remained silent all these years? Janet's family continue searching for the answers they have spent decades waiting for. Janet Murgatroyd is more than just a cold case murder victim. Beyond the headlines, police files, and unanswered questions was a young woman with dreams, ambitions, and an entire future ahead of her. A daughter, a friend, and someone remembered by those who knew her as bright, caring, and full of life. Nearly 3 decades later, Janet is still deeply missed, and our thoughts remain with her family and everyone who loved her. May Janet never be forgotten. Thank you for watching and listening to Janet's story. Please feel free to leave your own thoughts, comments, and theories down below, and we'll see you next time.